Let's take a look at this here real quick. These are the files. And these are, I put on the title here, major files. We'll see, I'm gonna hop over here with our first example, and we're gonna look at the file structure of a virtual machine. And you'll see that there's a couple extra files in here. Some of them are provided for compatibility. You know, if you were to move this virtual machine out to VMware Workstation or Fusion on the Mac or something like that. So there are going to be a couple other extra little files in there that I don't have addressed on here, but these are the major files and what they are. So you have the .vmx. This is, of course, the big one. This is all of the configuration for that virtual machine. So that's what defines the virtual machine and everything about it. When you go into a virtual machine and you edit its settings, that's the file that you're editing. Now this is a plain text file, and I'm going to show you this in just a couple minutes. We'll open one. You can edit this manually. For very, very few, very advanced features, the only way to put that feature in is to edit that VMX directly. There are some features that you cannot do through the GUI, mostly because they're either very, very uncommon features or things that, well, frankly, VMware doesn't really want you doing. VMware will tell you, do not modify the .vmx file directly. That's VMware's official stance on it until you get into forums and, trouble tickets and stuff like that, and then all of a sudden they're telling you to edit one. But generally speaking, the VMX file is supposed to be hands-off. We are supposed to use the graphical tools to create a VMX. But again, to be perfectly honest, if you knew that VMX file inside out and backwards and you knew everything about it, you can completely create a virtual machine from scratch in, pick your favorite text editor, Notepad, whatever, writing a .vmx file. It's nothing but a plain text config file that defines a virtual machine. Next is the .vmdk. And a lot of people mistakenly think that the VMDK is the hard disk file. The fact of the matter is it's not. The VMDK is a file that lists the virtual disk characteristics. And again, we can open one of these and look at it. We'll mess around here in just a couple minutes. The actual data, the big file, the file that is actually the virtual machine's disk that holds the data, is actually the -flat.vmdk, that third file there. So the .vmdk points to the -flat.vmdk. So I'm just trying to show you that when we look at the file system, the virtual machine that I've picked on to show you here this morning has a 40 gig hard drive. So the file that's going to be 40 gigs is the -flat.vmdk. The .vmdk file is, we'll see in a minute, I want to say it's like 508 bytes or something like that. Very, very small. Very small. The interesting thing is in all of the VMware management tools. And we'll talk a little bit more about management tools in a minute as I switch over to the web client. But in both the regular vSphere client, the standalone Windows application, which we'll go ahead and get this out of the way right now. VMware really does not want you using that anymore. I mean, it hasn't gone officially for retirement. There are a couple additional features that you can purchase, Update Manager and a couple other things that actually do still require that old client. If you're going to run your vCenter server as a virtual machine on one of your hosts, you sort of need the old client just to deploy vCenter Server. The vCenter Server appliance comes as an OVA, and we'll deal with those today. But that's how it comes, and I'm not really sure how you would deploy that onto your host through the web client, since the web client actually comes from vCenter Server. So again, you sort of have that logic problem. you can't get to the web page until vCenter's up. And vCenter's not going to be up until you deploy it. So you would still need the old client at least to deploy vCenter Server. The nice thing is once you have vCenter Server deployed, really, unless, like I said, unless you're using one of those additional features, you shouldn't need the old vSphere client again. Which, by the way, if we have any Mac users on the line or Linux users here, that's really a nice thing because the web client works, and I haven't used it a whole lot in Linux, to be honest with you. I use it a ton on the Mac, and I can tell you, starting with 5.1, we actually have full functionality on the Mac now. They even added, there's something called there's the web plugin that you need to do certain things. If you want to deploy an OVA, if you want to open the console to a virtual machine, there are certain features that you actually have to install a plugin to your browser. In 5.0, that plugin wasn't available for the Mac or Linux. In 5.1 and 5.5 it is, and I can tell you from experience it works perfectly fine. You can now console into virtual machines. I've not found anything that I can't do from my Mac now, which is nice because, again, the old client was Windows only. Now, we all know there's ways around that, right? You know, you could maybe get it working in Wine or something like that on Linux, or, you know, run it in a Windows virtual machine on your Mac or Linux workstation. So, you know, there's always ways around, but it's sort of nice that we don't have to use those ways around anymore. So once your initial deployment's done, you could really remove the old vSphere client. I will say this though, if you do still use the vSphere client a lot, you want to start using the web client. They haven't come out and said that they're officially getting rid of it on X date or X version. I have not heard anything official of it's absolutely going away. Because like I said, there are still times you need it. If you're not running vCenter Server, you still need it. You know, there's a version of ESXi for free. And I shouldn't say there's a version. I should say there's a free license for ESXi. Ultimately, the binary code that's executing is exactly the same download. So it's not like it's a separate free version. It's just that there's a free license. And just so we're clear, if you do want to mess around with this and install a server and everything and maybe use it at home and use the free version, when we talk about the free version of ESXi, I am not talking about running it in its 60-day demo. When you're running in the 60-day evaluation, you have full Enterprise Plus features, you can do everything, and that's what you actually want to do if you're studying because you need all those extra features. The free version is actually a permanent license. You register it with VMware, and they send you a license key, and you install that license, and it's permanent. It's just that it takes away most of the features. All right, so I mean, you still have virtualization. You can still run virtual machines, but you can't run vCenter Server. You can't do about 95% of what we're going to go over today on the free version. Okay, but if all you want to do is run some virtual machines at home, you're just trying to maybe build a lab, maybe you're trying to study some Cisco stuff, and you want to deploy the CSR 1000V for some practice, you can do that on the free version. You don't, and that can be a permanent install then. But a lot of the stuff we're going to look at today, not supported in the free version, just so we're clear, okay? All right, so let's get back to our files here. So NVRAM is where it stores all the settings for the BIOS. The virtual machine is, of course, simulating a motherboard, and we'll talk more about this when we get to virtual machine hardware in a couple minutes. But we're simulating a motherboard to this guest operating system, and of course, motherboards have BIOS or EFI. So if you've not changed any settings in that virtual machine BIOS, that NVRAM file is essentially empty. I mean, it's still there, it still creates it, but it's essentially empty. What it's storing in that file is changes that you make to the BIOS, okay? The virtual machine swap file is, well, like it sounds, if you run out of physical RAM, it will start using that virtual machine swap file. I'm going to talk more about memory management quite a bit later. It's going to be one of our rather important topics today. VMware does numerous things to help prevent running out of RAM. Because, of course, one of the things we can do, one of the big advantages to VMware, is we can oversubscribe a host. So we could have a host that only has, we'll say, 16 gigs of RAM in it. So it'd be a relatively small host, you know, maybe a lab use, probably not really production, but 16 gigs of RAM. Nothing at all would stop me from creating 16 virtual machines, all having 4 gigs of RAM allocated to them, and starting all of them at once. And I'm completely oversubscribing the host's memory. Physically, there's only 16 gigs of RAM, and I just turned on 16 machines that think they have 4 gigs each. So I've got a 4-to-1 oversubscription going on. That would probably be a little excessive. I would not recommend that. But there's nothing to stop you from doing it. And what happens is, you know, if all of those virtual machines were actually only using 800 meg, you'd be fine. There'd be no problem at all. Each of those has the potential to use 4 gigs of RAM because we allocated that to the virtual machine, but that does not mean that the operating system is actually going to use the whole 4 gigs of RAM. It's going to depend on what you're doing. So here's where the virtual swap file comes in. And just to let you know, we really do not want to be using this file. It's going to be created, it's going to exist, and that's fine, but we should never be using this file. If you're using this file, you need to reevaluate your environment. You have too many virtual machines running and not enough memory. So order more RAM for your server. If your server can't handle more RAM, buy a second server, third server, 8th server, 400th server, whatever. But you need to expand your environment. Here's the thing. Like I said, we'll cover memory management later, but you know, hopefully we all understand that whatever guest operating system you're running, Windows, Linux, whatever it is, it has its own swap file that it uses for its own memory swapping. And I want you to understand that has nothing to do with this. That is inside the guest, and that's Windows or Linux, whatever, doing its own thing for memory management. Okay, that has nothing to do with this file right here. This file is far worse than that. When the virtual machine, when the guest does swapping, when Windows or Linux does swapping, it makes an intelligent decision. It looks at the applications running on the operating system. It looks at what blocks of RAM have been used recently and which ones haven't, and it swaps the unused portions of RAM, you know, ones that have not been addressed for a long time. Those are the ones that it chooses to swap out to the hard drive. Because we know, of course, that hard drive is exponentially slower than RAM, of course. So swapping is, you know, pretty much always a bad thing. But, you know, there are cases where it's done, obviously. I mean, Windows just does it on its own from time to time because it, well, I don't know, wants to, whatever. But here's the thing. This swap file is different than that. This swap file is the guest is asking for more and more and more RAM. The host is physically out of RAM. We have done every other memory management task that we can think of. And like I said, VMware has quite a few things in its arsenal. Okay, it has something called the Balloon driver that we'll talk about later. This is one of the things you get with VMware tools. So later when we talk about VMware tools and I get extremely adamant about always installing VMware tools, I want you to understand that my biggest concern is memory management. Does it give us some other cool stuff? Absolutely. But the biggest thing I want out of it is memory management. because what we get is the balloon driver. And we'll talk about that more later. But you know, the VM kernel will try to use the balloon driver. It will try to actually compress RAM, because even compressed RAM is faster than going to the hard drive. So, like I said, we'll go over this, but you know, it's got several things that it will attempt before it goes to this virtual machine swap file. This virtual machine swap file is, the host is completely out of memory. We have nothing else to do. I have got to start taking some of the RAM from this virtual machine and dumping it to the hard drive. And the problem here is it's the VMware kernel doing this. Well, the VM kernel really has no idea what's going on inside of that virtual machine. All it knows is who's asking for RAM and what RAM blocks are being used. That's all it knows. So it will attempt to grab blocks that have not been used for a while, but there's really nothing to say that it's not going to accidentally grab your network card driver and swap it out to a hard drive, or your video driver for the virtual machine. I mean, it shouldn't, but I'm just, you know, showing worst case scenario. This is the VM kernel relatively blindly having to just grab RAM and throw it to the hard drive. And this is a last ditch resort. So like I said, this vswap file, it's going to be there. It creates it. It'll be ready to go. But we really want to monitor our performance in VMware and make sure that we're actually never using it. Okay, and I'll show you how to do that a little bit later. There's of course log files. That's pretty self-explanatory. But understand that they're virtual machine log files. These are not the ESX log files. Those are stored on the ESX host itself. Okay. There's also a suspend file. So if you don't power off a virtual machine, if you just suspend it, okay, just like you sort of do with your laptop, that sort of thing. If you were to suspend the operating system, it creates a VMSS file. Basically, it's a snapshot of RAM, so that when it restores it, it can put the RAM back the way it was. Okay. And then these last two files have to do with snapshots. The first one is the snapshot information, and the second one is the snapshot data file. We'll get back to these a little bit more when we get to snapshots. I just wanted to put them on this list because they are pretty important.